Amen.
Amen.
So think about the stories and movies that grip us the most. The courageous person or people that take on an insurmountable odds, who overcome obstacles and sinister forces that oppose them, to win the day, to get the prize, to save the world, confirm the truth, and usually find themselves along the way. Often the courageous person has some special ability, and the forces of evil are otherworldly as well. Yup, whether you're talking about Rocky, The Lord of the Rings, The Avengers, or Beauty and the Beast, or Moana, the story is basically the same with just different characters and different twists. But the reason why those stories capture us is because it is really God's story. How He welcomes us to join Him in doing good, conquering evil, overcoming obstacles, believing Him, validating the truth, and gaining the promised land, and finding ourselves along the way. But God's story is a better story because it is real, and it meets us in our lives every day. And we really do see this being played out in our passage this morning in Numbers 13 and 14. Not that we'll get to 14 this morning, but the point is, at this point, that it really has taken the Israelites a fairly short time to get to the promised land. Honestly, I was surprised that it was only like a chapter and a half that it took them to get to the promised land, because I'm thinking of the 40 years it took them. But that, we're going to see, is about punishment, not about God's will. And so therefore, as you are in Numbers 13, just reading the first couple of verses as we see how the story plays out, and again, how really the good versus evil dynamic that we see in our world really does play out here. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites." Now, we just want to stop here for a moment, because it's interesting that when Moses is recounting this story in Deuteronomy chapter 1, recounting it for a new generation, he says that it was the people's idea to explore the land, and then he thought well of that and thought it was a good idea. Now, obviously, God was also okay with it, because it's described here as God commanding the Israelites to do this. So to me, I think it's a chance for us to really think about what this means in terms of what God is intending for us to understand as we think about this a bit. First, it's interesting how God and man's will interact here. That ultimately, when we think about what God would ultimately intend, what God would even effectively initiate. See, certainly the idea that they investigate the land isn't a sinful idea. It's not like a bad idea. So the fact that God would recognize that they desire to do this, He knows it's going to happen, because again, He is sovereign, He's all-knowing, so He knows they're going to investigate the land. So as the request comes from them to Moses, Moses sees it as a good idea. So God says, you know something, I see the value in this. I see the testing that's going to be involved in terms of them investigating the land. So God ultimately is okay with this. But really, are they living in God's ultimate will or His permissive will? Because I don't know that God would initiate this. I mean, think about what this land was. This was the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the land that consistently throughout Scripture is the promised land. It's the gift of God. It's the place that is a place of blessing. It is a place that flows with milk and honey in terms of what God has provided there and why God has called them to this area of the world. It's also honest in terms of the assessment of the nations that will be needed to drive out of the land. That God never said in terms of this promised land, they're just going to waltz in and not have to do anything. That He actually says in the book of Leviticus, if you remember our study here, is that the land, the ground actually was calling out because of the evil practices of the people in Canaan, that God was actually driving those people out because of the kind of people they were, because of the evil that they perpetuated. And so ultimately, when you think about all of that in terms of what God has communicated, why do you need to investigate that? Why do you have to look into what God has already said is your blessing and is already your possession? See, my point in saying all this is that there's a kind of investigation that is about faith, and there's a kind of investigation that is about doubt. See, when God is calling you to something, to investigate, to discern His plan, to observe His provisions, to get excited about what you see Him doing in terms of leading you to this point, all that is fine. All of that is good. But to investigate, to build fear and hesitation, to discover all the reasons why you shouldn't do it, that ultimately is bad. See, ultimately, when you think about what God is calling you to, you really have to think of just what place does investigation have to have in that. Say, for instance, I hope you understand what I'm talking about, but say, for instance, God has called you to minister in Sunday school. You know you have an ability to teach or a heart for children, and you just know that that's what God would want you to do. Now, ultimately, to say, well, hey, Matt, can I sit into a Sunday school class? Can I know how this works? Can I get a sense of the curriculum? Can I meet the kids? But again, if that investigation is about, I'm just confirming God's plan, I'm getting excited in terms of what God is doing, but see, you know the difference between that type of investigation as opposed to I'm going in there saying, okay, let me find out all the reasons why, I have to prepare that often, or I have to teach that often, or boy, this kid is in the class, or I'm going into my investigation with all this doubt in terms of, again, let me find out why I shouldn't do this. See, now again, this is when God's plan is clear for you. I mean, ultimately, if we are trying to discover God's will, like I don't know what God would have me to do, investigation is a fine part of that process. But again, we're still engaging with God in terms of what the potential, what the promise, what the provision, what the power is for us to be able to do those things. But again, we're talking about a situation the Israelites are in where they know God is with them. They know God has promised this land. So again, this investigation, to the extent it ultimately creates that doubt, we have to wonder why they want to investigate in the first place. So just watch that in terms of what our investigation is creating in our hearts. So basically, as you move on from those verses in chapter 13, in verses 3 through 25, Moses picks 12 representatives from the tribes of Israel. He actually changes Hoshea's name to Joshua. That's in verse 16, kind of a neat little in parentheses there, that Hoshea means salvation, and Joshua means Jehovah is salvation. So a neat little name change that happens, and Joshua naturally being one of the 12 that is assigned to see the land, amongst Caleb amongst them as well. Basically, from verses 3 through 25, it tells the 12 guys what to look for and tells where the guys went, covering the whole of Palestine, investigating land for 40 days. So now let's pick it up in verse 26. You see, and read with me here. It says in verse 26 of Numbers 13, they came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. You see that doubt? See that hesitation? You see, let me find the reasons why we can't do this. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. Those are tall people. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. Do you see what is happening here? This really is the moment of decision. In our favorite movies, this is when Rocky is deciding, is he going to fight again? 5 times over. But don't we love that story? Whether it's Apollo Creed, whether it's Mr. T, whether it's the Russians, or in 6, isn't he battling old age? Like, is he gonna fight again? Are the Avengers gonna stop squabbling? Is Moana gonna recognize that she really does have the way around the fire god and following the purpose that a grandmother is? See, that moment of decision that every hero has to decide, I see the challenges and I'm gonna overcome them. I'm not going to be beat down by them. I'm going to beat them down. But see, in God's economy, in God's story, it's going to take faith to move mountains. It's going to take faith to conquer giants. It's going to take humility that says, I don't know the way. Your way is better. And it's going to take the will to have the courage to do it. But do you see here the 4 things that faith or lack of faith does? First, a faith or lack of faith affects how you perceive your circumstances. I mean, basically the 10 spies saw giants. They saw land that devoured the people. They saw what was good. But see, those things didn't matter. All the things that they were perceiving. See, when I think of the juxtaposition, the comparison between the 10 spies and Joshua and Caleb, they were seeing the same people. They were seeing the same land. And Joshua and Caleb were perceiving that based in faith, and the 10 spies were perceiving it based in doubt, based on a lack of understanding of God, and in human perception. Really, it's a call to us to think of, in terms of our lives, what do we find ourselves living by? Are we living by faith, or are we living by sight? Are we operating based on what our perception is, what our understanding is, what we think is good? You know, the book of Proverbs warns us that there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end, it leads to destruction. And so also when we think of ourselves as believers, when we think about what faith means, by definition, that's going to be a path that is going to contradict things operating inside me. It's going to contradict things that I see, things that I understand. And I think another level of this even is beyond just whether we're people of faith or people of sight. Even better, are we letting faith dictate what you see and how you see it? Because that's what faith ultimately seeks to do. How do you look at the world? How do you look at yourself? How do you think about the things you should prioritize and what life should be about? You know, when you're thinking about maybe you're just going back to the conversation about unbelievers and those outside of Christ. And a lot of Christians I hear describing unbelievers, and they might talk about, oh, but they're such a good person, or they do all these good things, or they're so kind, or they're nice. You know something, if they're unregenerate, if they're outside of Christ, none of that matters. So am I going to perceive them in the right way? That in spite of how they are in comparison to other human beings, they're lost in their spiritual state? And so therefore the role that God would have for me in their lives is to bring them to knowledge, bring them to faith, bring them to exposure to the gospel and to Christ. When I'm assessing temptation, when I'm assessing sin, when I'm assessing priorities, is about what I think. Am I perceiving things according to my understanding or Ann Lander's understanding or whoever, well, I'm not even, you can't say Oprah anymore, right? Does she still say so? Yes, okay. But all the things that we say, that we start driving our lives and dictating our lives based on the perception of the world rather than God's perception. And we have to watch that. Because again, faith drives the way we see things. See, that's why it's so important for us to be in the Word. See, because we have to understand, the Word is not about knowledge. It's about food. It's about God changing your perception in ways that in intermittent exposure, it just doesn't work. This is not the chemistry text you read in high school that I need to read this so I can pass the test. I have enough knowledge to get through this. No, this is life-changing information that transforms who you are so that now all of a sudden your mind and your heart are different because the way faith is changing your perception. That's what God seeks to accomplish. That's what's required in terms of possessing the land and seeing it for what it is, not looking at giants, but looking at a God that is bigger. I mean, do you realize that can't should never be part of our communication with God? Do you realize that can't should never be part of our communication with God? I can't do that. I don't have the ability. The only thing that we should say to God is shouldn't. See, we speak to God in terms of shoulds and shouldn'ts, not can and can'ts. Because ability is never the question. Because ultimately, when God calls you to something, when God gives you a will, the fact that He will empower you and has provided for you is an inherent part of the call. So God will never call you to something that with His power you will not be able to accomplish. So the only question we have is shoulds and shouldn'ts in terms of what God's will is. I mean, and in fact, if we allow can'ts to be part of the dynamic in our conversation with God, a lot of the shoulds that we should do are things that we can't do in our flesh. And so that's why we have to kind of erase that in terms of our communication. It's never about what I can or can't do, what my ability is, but God, what are you calling me to? And what does faith then generate in terms of the pursuit, the confidence, the conquering that is part of that? And so again, faith drives our perception. The second thing that faith does, our perception of circumstances particularly, the second thing faith or lack of faith does is drive our perception of ourselves. Look at this last sentence in chapter 13. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. This has always been an interesting verse to me. Because the question I have is, how do they know? How do they know how the Canaanites looked at them? They certainly know how they looked at the Canaanites, but what, did they walk up to one of these giants and say, by the way, you look like a giant to me in my eyes. Do I look like a grasshopper in your eyes? I need confirmation of the fact that obviously didn't do that. But rather, what are they doing? They are letting their perception of themselves being projected on someone else. See, when you look at a giant and you perceive things as a giant, it's very easy to think that you are a grasshopper. But again, when you think about what faith does in terms of driving our perception of ourselves, we have to watch how that operates. See, because we have to watch out for the tendency of projecting our perception of ourselves onto other people. I mean, you hear people saying, and maybe you think in your minds, oh, they don't really like me. Or maybe they do like me. And they really haven't said anything about liking you or not liking you. It's just that you really don't like yourself, or you really do like yourself. And because you like yourself, you project on people that they like you, or you don't like yourself and you project on them that they don't like you. You know, both are wrong. Both can be deceived in terms of like, you think people like you and they really don't. That's supposed to be funny. Or again, you just assume. But see, it's really about what are you thinking about yourself. And you know, when I think about again that story, that part of the story that is endearing to us, that again, people confront themselves. They confront in these, these movies and these stories that we love so much. They confront themselves. They confront the inner turmoil. They find themselves. Well, do you know that that's part of God's plan for you? When we talk about what the promised land is for us, in some ways, us finding ourselves, determining who we are before God is an important part of that. See, basically, it is only possible to correctly relate to ourselves by correctly relating to our Creator. But it is part of what God wants for you. It's part of what He wants to us. He wants us to understand who we are in light of His design, what He has made us to be, what He has made us for, in terms of just the type of people we are and what God has created us for. And so therefore, when we think about, again, how faith operates in terms of driving our perception of ourselves, what do we believe about ourselves? I mean, there are aspects of what we think in terms of ourselves that can be too lofty and too low. And the only way to correctly assess who we are is to come before our Creator and say, God, what do you think of me? What have you declared about me? But in order for that to operate, we have to believe, don't we? We have to operate in faith to come to God and say, I believe what you say is true. I mean, there's an aspect of, again, how faith and lack of faith drives our perception of ourselves, that we can really get to a place where we inaccurately assess who we are based in terms of being too high or too low, because again, we're not engaging with God because of his perception and what he thinks. See, basically it is God's right and his desire as our creator for us to learn who we are before him. Do you see how that's an inherent part of who God is? That if he has created us, he has created us in his image. He has created us to be beautiful people in terms of our giftedness, our ability, our talents, how he seeks to partner with us to accomplish his plan. So do you think for a moment he doesn't want you to understand accurately who you are in his economy and who you are in relation to him? Absolutely he does. But for those part of us that need to be humbled, those parts of us that need to be brought low in terms of who we think we are that we really aren't, and those things that we are, those things that we aren't that we really are because of what he declares. See, but it's all about understanding the Word. It's all about understanding his perception. It's all about learning the truth of who we are before our God. You know, it would be very easy for you, if you have any awareness of the Word at all, for you to turn to a bunch of scriptures that make you look like you are scum of the earth, lower than an ant, drag on the ground, stamp on down in your foot, and you're nothing. And then you'll find other scriptures that lift you high in terms of you're blessed and you have a royal inheritance, you're in Christ, and you're righteous and you're pure, and you're glorified in Christ, and you'll share in his glory, you're co-heirs with Christ in terms of God's purpose and God's plan, and God's call and God's election of you in terms of what he's done and welcoming you in his kingdom. And things that lift you high in terms of who you are in Christ. But see, that's the point of what we are in terms of how faith drives our perception of ourselves. That what's better than to know what your Creator thinks and then think the same thing about yourself, right? See, rather than walking around and letting people be your reference points, oh, that person thinks I'm a grasshopper, so I feel like a grasshopper. That person thinks I'm a grasshopper, so I feel like I'm a grasshopper. Don't you do that? I mean, I'm speaking to the choir, right? Like you get this in terms of how we, again, project our impressions of ourselves on other people, and God would desire for that to be different. See, in this, God's story is a better story. The completion, the transformation that he can bring about in terms of our perception of ourselves and what he's calling us to is far greater than we might observe in the story or in the movies. I think a third thing that faith or lack of faith does is we spread our faith or lack of faith to others. See, it's a natural part of believing something or not believing something. And understand that when we're not believing something, we're also believing something. So for these 10 spies that have gone into the land and aren't believing God, they are believing themselves. They are believing their perception. They are believing the fear that is being projected in their hearts. And what they can't help do, what you can't help do, is talk to people about what you believe. And so what I would ask you to think about is that as you're talking to other people, what are they hearing from you? Are they hearing doubt? Are they hearing fear? Are they hearing... that just went away. Fear, doubt. Lost it. But there were three. I always speak to... Never mind. Yeah, so in other words, what are you projecting to other people? It's still not coming down. I'm trying to talk it. You know what I'm saying, though. In terms of, are we projecting things to other people? The faith that we're declaring is about our perception and our understanding of things. Or are we talking about glory? Are we talking about goodness? Are we talking about the things that are possible and potential in terms of who God is? See, what is our reference point as we ultimately are communicating to that other people? Because you know what? People are listening. People are observing. People are hearing the way you speak, and they are either being drawn closer to God because of your life, or they're being pushed further away. And that's what we have to think about. See, well, let me give you just a little precursor to chapter 14. these 10 guys are going to die. That there's 40 years that the generation that they represent, they're going to travel in the desert for 40 years. These 10 guys are going to die. You know why? Because they projected that garbage to the community. You had a responsibility in terms of what you were entrusted with to go see that land in the context of faith and bring us back a report that magnified God rather than fear, magnified God rather than yourself. And so God forbid, you have that responsibility, you have the truth, you know who God is, and you're talking in ways that you don't. You're talking in ways of doubt. You're talking in ways of fear. You're talking in ways of sin. You're not talking in terms of righteousness and truth and integrity and glory and peace and honor. You're not talking about all the ways that, again, would be reflective of, I'm operating from a context of knowing the God of creation. I have a confidence and awareness of who I am before Him and who He is on top of me that ultimately allows me now to say to you this or that. And it's very different what we communicate. See, the fourth thing that faith or lack of faith does is it either takes the possession or it doesn't take the possession. It either moves forward or it doesn't move forward. And see, basically you have to think about what God is calling us to in terms of our promised land. God is telling you, I want you to be the hero. I want you to be the one that's overcoming the obstacles, that's seeing the giant and saying, I can slay them, that we can take that land because God has promised me, that I can venture into ministry or relationship or evangelism because I know who God is, I know what God has called me to, I know what He will therefore equip me for, so I'm moving forward. And not that there won't be failure, there won't be stumbling, won't be doubting along the way, but in terms of what we're pressing into, what we're pressing onto, in terms of what God is calling us to, what God desires. See, basically what I want you to leave with this morning is I do want you to think, because I don't think we'll get to it today. Great video I'll show you next week. I'm just going to pray, particularly if you're a Lord of the Rings fan. I'll just reference. Yeah. So anyways, I want you to think about, again, what is your promised land? What are the giants that exist there? And you know something, if I was a certain kind of pastor, what I ought to be saying in terms of the promised land, you're going to have riches, and you're going to have wealth, and you're going to have blessing, and you're going to have health, and you're going to have prosperity. But I'm not that kind of pastor. Because ultimately, that's not what the promised land is about. See, now, it can be about blessing. You know, God is a God that blesses materially, and part of what He provides for His people throughout the Scriptures is blessing in terms of that. But that's really not what I think our promised land is. I think it's a life of what the Spirit enables, what the Spirit infuses us with, what God would call us to in terms of service, what God would call us to in terms of evangelism, what God would call us to in terms of dedication to Him and relationship and fellowship with Him. But think about what is it when you go before God and you put yourself in the shoes of the spies and you think about assessing your land, assessing your promise, assessing the place where God is asking you to be a hero, to have victory over sin, to witness to that person, whatever it is that's holding you up. And God is saying, there's the promised land. What are you going to be looking at? Are you going to be looking at me, or are you going to be looking at the giants? And so think about what that promised land is. Think about what are the giants that hold you back. And bring those before God, and then we'll talk about them next week. And so let's bow and let's pray this morning. Father, you are a great God, and you call us to a great purpose. That as I even, B probably wouldn't want me to even talk about her, but when I think about B sharing her coming to Jesus so long ago, and all that has meant now in her growth and her maturity, and what the blessing that she is to us, to various people in her life, in terms of her just living out her life with Christ to other people, it is undeniable in terms of her being an agent and an emissary of the kingdom of God in other people's lives. And to me, that looks like the promised land. That looks like what you would have us possess in terms of the influence we would have. But Father, I know that is also very individual in terms of our life, in terms of what you would call us to. What is the character development you're calling us to? What is the sacrifice you're calling us to? What is the submission you're calling us to? What is the glory you're calling us to in that submission? Father, I pray that you would give us eyes to see and eyes to assess our souls, how we have been assessing what you're calling us to, and what is holding us back, what is keeping us from moving forward, so that ultimately we would be the kind of people that stand up in our own souls, like Joshua and Caleb, and say, we can do this, I can do this, I can have victory. And what I project to other people is that we can have victory, so let's go for it. And so, Father, I just pray that you do a work in our hearts as individuals and our hearts as a body in terms of just what you're calling us to, in terms of what our promised land is. And so, Father, we lift these things in ourselves. See, we give ourselves away, not just because we sing it, but because we do it. And Father, I just pray you help us to see what that is. And so, Father, we lift all these things before you in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Amen.